Dear friends, I think we should start now to the afternoon session of our symposium. Of this session is the visual witnesses, and we have very valuable speakers in this session too. The first speaker will be Dr. Antonios Botanakis from Hellenic Mediterranean University. We are very lucky to have Dr. Botanakis here for the past 2 days in order to carry out a workshop on Byzantine notation reading. So we are very honored and happy to have him here in Ankara, in Bilkent University and Hacettepe University. Now, if it is comfortable for him, I would like to give the first word to Dr. Botanakis. Dear Professor Botanakis, the word is yours.
Dear Dr. Yuray, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for your kind words. It's really an honor to be here, to be invited here, and to be able to transmit some of my knowledge with your highly esteemed students at this university. In order to not waste any more time, I shall begin my presentation. Please tell me if you can see my presentation clearly on your window. Is it visible? Okay, thank you very much. So let's begin. Illuminations of musical instruments, the case study of the Book of Psalms. Belonging in the Old Testament, the Psalter, or in other words, the Book of Psalms, is a collection of poems that was originally composed in Hebrew and later translated to Greek. This poetic anthology constitutes one of the oldest and richest resources for the development of the spiritual life and an expression of worship of both Jewish and Christian tradition. Indefinable number of believers have frequently searched Psalms for hope, help, inspiration, and internal salvation, where in despair or in distress. The expression of human words addressed to God, either in request or in praise, can satisfactorily explain why this anthology is the longest in length book, the most copied and translated work of the Hebrew Bible. It was indeed the first book to receive wide distribution through the printing press when, in the middle 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg published the first printed Psalter. Trying to date with precision when the Psalms were composed is proven a task much more difficult than expected, if not impossible. Perhaps one logical hypothesis, which may be safe to follow, is that the composition of the Psalms was an activity that lasted several centuries. Many of the Psalms have been attributed to King David, who existed around 1000 BCE, and few of them must have been as early as the reign of King Solomon, roughly in the mid-10th century BCE, or even earlier, the period when the Israelites had no central government, between the 14th to the 11th century BCE. Many others were probably written during the First Commonwealth era, known as the First Temple period, that extended from around 1000 to 586 BCE. Furthermore, Psalm 136, that is widely known as By the Rivers of Babylon, refers to the exile of the Jews in 586 BCE, whereas Psalm 125 refers to the return to Zion, a synonym for Jerusalem, as well as for the land of Israel as a whole, that began a few decades later in 538 BCE. So, is it possible to delimit with precision the era when the Psalms were composed, or to determine at least what was the source of inspiration? In an attempt to answer this latter question, it is important to note that many contemporary scholars do support the idea that psalms in general, or hymns to the gods, were extremely common in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and in Syro-Canaanite poetry several centuries before the kingdom of David. The Canaanite religion flourished at the geographical area of modern Israel Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, and featured a group of ancient Semitic practices by the Canaanites from the early Bronze Age through the 1st centuries AD. Their religion was mainly polytheistic. We're aware of those literary works from texts discovered on the Mediterranean coast of Syria, written in 1400 BCE, many centuries before the biblical writings. Therefore, many verbal formulas, sporadic elements of mythology, and archaic texts became, in a way, the very source of inspiration for later writers. However, we should not thoughtlessly consider that subsequent writers translated this pagan literature or Canaanite poems, but instead they adopted and transformed these ancient polytheistic literate works. This may explain to an extent why Canaanite religious figures such as Baal, the storm god who was worshipped in many ancient Middle Eastern communities, appears in the book of Psalms, specifically in Psalm 105. A similar case stands for the sea monster Leviathan that the group of the 70 Jewish scholars, referred to as LXX in Roman numbering, translated in the Greek Septuagint as dragon in Psalms 73 and 103. To conclude, perhaps it is safe to consider that the Psalms composition was indeed a painstaking activity that took place over many centuries, and furthermore, the psaltery itself should not be entirely attributed to David, taking into consideration that many of the Psalms are referring to events that happened many years following his kingdom. After all, the inscription, a Psalm of David, referring to the small introductory sentence that precedes many of the Psalms, is not a valid indication of authorship, since those psalm headings were possibly added during the Second Temple period, lasting from 513 to 70 CE. Of course, one cannot doubt that the majority of the Psalms were actually composed by David, 86 in total, but in other cases, some of the Psalms are ascribed to different historical figures, poets, and musicians, like Solomon, Asaph, Ethan, Moses, and others that are highlighted in this slide. To summarize the above, it is safe to conclude that the compilation of the Psalms probably began sometime around the 10th century BC, if not earlier, and finished not later than the 4th century of the same millennium, when the 70s provided the ancient Jewish Greek translation of Hebrew scripture, the Septuagint. By the early 2nd century CE, the Book of Psalms was regarded as the foundation of the sacred writings, together with the Hebrew Torah, also known as Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, and the Book of Prophets. The anthology of the Psalms is divided to 5 sections, or books, following the structure that corresponds to the Pentateuch, separated by 4 doxologies. Book 1, Psalms 1 to 41. Book 2, Psalms 42 to 72. Book 3, Psalms 73 to 89. Book 4, Psalms 90 to 106. And Book 5, Psalms 107 to 150. Psalm 151, which is of extreme importance to this paper, is superscripted in Greek manuscripts as supernumerary, indicating that no number is affixed to it. A Hebrew version of these Psalms was widely unknown until the discovery of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, dated between 30 and 60 CE. The scrolls that refer to the 151st Psalms were discovered in Cave 11 at Qumran Caves in the Judean desert, 105 kilometers from the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea in 1956. Many psalters embody luxurious illumination. A great number of decorated psalters have survived from the 9th to the 16th century, which indicates the popularity of the anthology among medieval men, women, scholars, noble patrons, priests, and monks. The illuminated Byzantine psalters can be divided into 2 distinct categories regarding the way the illuminations are depicted. The first category are the aristocratic psalters that include full-page miniatures, contrary to the marginal psalters, where the illustrations fill the margin surrounding the main body of the text. In the following examples, regarding the illumination featuring musical instruments, we will encounter depictions of both psalters. Since most psalms are associated with David, it is not uncanny that he is featured on the frontispiece of numerous Byzantine manuscripts. The king prophet can be seen in his purple imperial chlamys, either standing with the book of Psalms in his hands or performing on musical instruments, namely the psaltery, the kithara, the lyre, the lute, or generic versions of bone-stringed instruments that resemble the modern violin. When David is not depicted alone, he is accompanied by either a female figure or by other musicians. In the first case, the female companion who is sitting next to David is identified as Melodia, who silently provided him with the inspiration needed to compose the psalms. In other manuscript, she is referred to as Prudence, implying the wisdom of the psalmist. Elsewhere, David is accompanied with musicians who praise the Lord by way of performing on their musical instruments. The names of the Levite musicians that are frequently mentioned in the Old Testaments were mainly Asaph, Heman, and Elithun, and their descendants, who were appointed as the temple musicians. From the illuminations at hand, we can observe the musicians performing on numerous musical instruments, characterized as David's instruments, namely bronze cymbals, lutes, shawms, psalteries, transverse flutes, trumpets, double-skin barley drums, and bowed chordophone instruments. First Psalm, passages 4 to 6. Not so the impious, not so. Rather, they are like the dust that the wind flings from off the land. Therefore, the impious will not rise up in judgment, nor sinners in the council of the righteous, because the Lord knows the way of the righteous, and the way of the impious will perish. This passage refers to the wind that scatters the wicked like dust. The illuminators chose to personify the wind as a male figure, blowing his trumpet over the sinful, who, like chaff, are tossed hither and thither by the wind. We can observe that in both examples, the figure of the damned ones lying on the ground wear the same outfit as the ones on the top, who study the law, follow Lord's commandments, and are blessed. 26th Psalm. The Lord is my illumination and my Savior. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my life's protector. Of whom shall I be in dread? I believe in order that I may see the good things of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Take courage and let your heart be strong and wait for the Lord. This psalm is attributed to David, according to the superscription, where the psalmist talks about his life before his appointment as a king. He is a pilgrim, committed to Lord's way, a worshipper seeking God's presence, who is strengthened by misfortune and awaits the divine promises. The illuminations depict David standing while holding a crook with one hand and a psaltery with the other. 57th Psalm, passages 4 to 6. Sinners were estranged from the womb, they erred from the belly. They spoke lies, they have wrath in the likeness of the snake, like an adder, deaf and plugging its ears, which will not listen to a voice of enchanters, nor of a charm being administered by a wise man. This psalm is a request to God for liberation from those who exercise the wicked power to the world. It is a psalm in which the psalmist prophesies God's judgment on evil. He calls on God to discipline them and set everything back in order, since he is the one who rules the earth and rewards the righteous. The corrupted rulers are likened to dangerous snakes, who are intent on evil from birth, deceptive by nature and selfish. They resemble to venomous adders that are isolated by their aggressive spirit, deaf to any voice or reason, that cannot be controlled even by the most skilled snake charmer. And that is exactly what the illumination depicts. Charmer trying desperately to detain the snake, that it is in front of him with the movement of his wind instrument. 67th Psalm, passages 1 and 2. Make a joyful noise to God, all the earth. Do make music to his name. Give glory to his praise. A thanksgiving psalm that invites the communicants to come and see in joyful music, The priests, whose holiness is already attested in the book of Leviticus, summon the believers to witness the wonders of the Lord, and therefore are depicting striking the simandron, a wooden board that is struck with a hammer, celebrating God's universal dominion. The simandron still serves nowadays as a call to prayer in Orthodox Christianity, mainly located in monasteries all around the globe. 80th Psalm, passages 3 and 4. Raise a melody and sound a drum, delightful harp with lyre, trumpet with a trumpet at a new moon, the high day of our feast. This is a psalm that calls for people to sing and shout in joy. They must sing a song of praise and express their happiness with music and musical instruments, namely drums, harps, and lyres. On the one hand, regarding the third strophe, the research has revealed only one illumination of a music ensemble that consists of one trumpet and two drums, visible on the left part of the illumination. On the other hand, the illumination that is frequently encountered in the Byzantine manuscripts relevant to the fourth verse depicts a male figure blowing a horn at the new moon, suggesting the beginning of the month and referring to the Feast of the Tabernacles. The Hebrew texts provide the word shofar, which characterizes a hollowed-out ram's horn that is blown like a trumpet. The shofar is mentioned several times in the Old Testament. We may recall, for example, the time when Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, the trumpets blast during the attack of Jericho, and in Gideon's battle. In the book of Psalms, the musician who blows the horn does not intend to musically accompany the festive occasion that was described before, but on the one hand, to sound the signal for people to gather, and on the other hand, to remind them of God's mercy and grace, taking into consideration that the sound of a trumpet is commonly employed in Byzantine literature as the appearance, presence, voice, or word of God. 91st Psalm, passages 1 to 4. It is good to acknowledge the Lord and to make music to your name, O Most High, in order to declare your mercy in the morning and your truth every night, on a 10-stringed harp with an ode on a lyre, because you, O Lord, made me glad by your work, and at the deeds of your hands I will rejoice. This psalm, that was perused by the Levites at the temple worship of the Sabbath day, begins with a call to praise, describes the destruction of the wicked, and glorifies the works of God with the use of musical instruments. Indeed, all manner of wood instruments were played by David and the Israelites before God, with the only exception of cymbals that were made of bronze. However, instead of depicting the two polychords, the illustrator decided to sketch two musicians, one playing the kithara with a plectrum and one hitting a pair of cymbals. The use of cymbals must not come as a surprise, since it is mentioned in the Old Testament that they were used widely to call for the attention of the congregation, the performance of divine songs. 105th Psalm, passages 19 to 20. And they made a calf at Choreb and did obeisance to the carved image, and they exchanged their glory for a likeness of a bull calf that eats grass. This didactic psalm exhibits the numerous sins of the Israelites and reminds the reader of the divine intervention in all their misfortunes. What is important to us is the sin of idolatry, the golden calf. The Bible mentions that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, Aaron, the brother of Moses, created a calf, a figurative representation of a deity, a symbol of fertility, strength, and might, after receiving the request from the Israelites and melting all the gold that they had in their possession. After that, he ordered a great feast, inviting all people to gather around and celebrate. When Moses descended from the mount and witnessed the Israelites worshipping that creature instead of the Lord, he became so enraged that he broke the stone tablets and had to ascend for a second time, so that the tablets could be written once more. This passage became the inspiration of illustrators who depicted the golden calf on an altar, people worshipping the idol and dancing and blowing on a natural horn in a celebration manner. 134th Psalm, passages 5 to 7. Because I knew that the Lord is great, and our Lord, in comparison with all the gods, whatever the Lord wanted, he did. The sky and on the earth, in the seas and in all deeps, breaking up clouds from the earth's end, he made lightnings into rain. He brought out winds from his storehouses. The psalm emphasizes the greatness of the Lord, who created the world, saved the Israelites from the Egyptians, and protected them throughout their journey to the promised lands. Psalmist acknowledges that the Lord is greater than all gods, highlights the great works of creation. Furthermore, he emphasizes that God, by rejecting all claims attributed to pagan deities, is the architect of everything, the one who has limitless dominion over heaven, earth, in the seas, and in the deeps. He can produce clouds, make and cause winds to blow throughout his kingdom at his will. Thus, the people of God must never lose their faith, but should trust in him, comfort in his creations, as a result of his internal love, and not to search for cosmological theories. To reflect God's greatness, the illuminators personified the four winds that surround the cosmos as male figures, blow their horns facing towards each other. The winds are positioned on the four corners of the ocean colored in blue that circle the earth in the shape of a rectangle, where trees and other plants are grown. 136 Psalm, passages 1 to 4. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, also wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows in its midst we hung up our instruments, because there our captors asked us for words of odes, and those who led us away for a hymn. Sing us some of the odes of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's ode in a foreign land? This psalm refers to the time when the Jewish people were forced in exile following the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem between 507 and 586 BC. The language is intense, and the choice of words reveals pain and despair. Even though the poetic text states that the Israelites sat by the rivers of Babylon, and normally rivers and trees constitute a natural source of pleasure, they could not forget about Zion, implying the city of Jerusalem, located on the homonymous mount. They felt the need to hang their musical instruments on the trees because they were unable to praise the Lord, being so far away from their homeland. The songs of triumph and joy were always focused on Zion and God because He was residing there with them. But now, having witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the loss of all their belongings, the death of their loved ones, perceiving an anxious life regarding their ominous future, and contemplating over the sins that provoked God's punishment, they fell into a great despair, became hopeless and insecure. They could not longer sing and praise God's strength and glorify His protection over them while in exile, residing on a foreign land. That can satisfactorily explain why the illustrators chose to depict the Israelites sitting down next to a river, with their musical instruments hanged on the nearby willows. Even though the translation of the 70 elders does not reveal the exact identity of those instruments, judging from illuminations at hand, we can recognize lutes, membrane drums, cymbals, sistrum, psalteries, and bowed string chordophones. In many of those illuminations, we can observe a group of Chaldeans standing to the left of the Israelites, taunting them, perform once again their majestic songs of victory and of praise to God. 150th Psalm, passages 3 to 4. Praise Him with trumpet sound, praise Him with harp and lyre, praise Him with drum and dance, praise Him with strings and instruments, praise Him with tuneful cymbals, praise Him with loud clashing cymbals. Psalm 150 constitutes a sumptuous praise for the Lord. The reference to this praise is not sporadically limited in some parts, but carries out throughout the entire psalm. Psalm 150 functions as a final doxology that harmonically concludes the entire collection of the Psalms, being not only the final psalm of Book 5, but the closing psalm of the poetic anthology as well. The psalmist invites all people to acclaim and sing the great wonders and the mighty deeds of the Lord in his sanctuary with all kinds of human means, with all kinds of musical expression. He advises the use of trumpets, psalteries, lyres, drums, cymbals, and other chordophone instruments as means of praise and acknowledgement that their existence is entirely dependent on the Lord. Thus, one can easily understand why in some Byzantine manuscripts we can observe one trumpeter. As already mentioned earlier, the trumpet would always sound the initial blast and invite everyone to praise. The Hebrew text, once again, identifies this instrument as shofar, denoting the natural horn, while the 70s provided us with the term salpinx, meaning trumpet in Greek. What is interesting to notice is the way the trumpet is being illustrated. It seems that it's being blown from the side, as in the case of the transverse flutes, and not from the narrow end. We have encountered similar illuminations of that instrument on other manuscripts as well, but no one can be exactly sure as to what has inspired or driven the illustrators to depict the blowing of the trumpet that way, in reference to this psalm. Next on, the poetic text mention of the harp and the lyre, two softer sounding chordophones that are very frequently mentioned in the Psalms. On the fourth verse, the psalmist encourages the congregation to dance as a form of praise, but not a dance as a prearranged choreography, but rather as a dance that celebrates the Lord, a modest dance, contrary to the secular or sensual dances. There is a great likelihood that the performers were holding hands and danced in circle, following the well-known illustrations of Miriam, sister of Aaron and Moses, when she and the rest of the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and spontaneously danced to rejoice over the Lord's astounding wonder. During this dance, according to the psalmist, several musical instruments will also participate. The 70s translations mentions of a drum, a stringed instrument, and a third instrument, but without determining their nature. The Hebrew text of the Psalms is much more informative. It speaks of the toph, a membranophone that resembles the tambourine, and features two membranes, the ugab, a musical instrument that resembles the shepherd's flute, and the minim, a stringed instrument that would probably be a generic version of the violin or would resemble the lute or the harp. All of the instruments mentioned before, with the addition of the cymbals, are magnificently illustrated inside an 11th century Byzantine manuscripts. Concluding, it is safe to consider that even though the Israelites did not probably use all of the above mentioned musical instruments at the temple worship, this ideal musical ensemble would serve as the medium of contact between the earthly and the divine cosmos, between people and God. Final Psalm 151. As we have already mentioned in the introduction, this psalm is characterized by the 70 scholars as being outside the number, as supernumerary, bearing no number indication. For instance, at the right part of the slide, you can see the Codex Vaticanus manuscript, dated to the 4th century, that shares the same inscription, though other manuscripts of the same period, such as Codex Sinaiticus on the left part, presents this psalm as canonical within the 151 Psalms of David. In any case, the psalm features David speaking in first person regarding the shepherding of his father's flocks, his musical skills, his selection by God, his annotation as the king, and his victory over Goliath. He reminiscences that he was the youngest of all his brothers, the seventh in order, according to the book of Chronicles. My hands made an instrument, my fingers tuned an harp. Logical questions arising regarding the nature of the first instrument. Neither the Greek translation nor the Hebrew text inform us of its identity. However, judging from the illuminations preserved inside Byzantine manuscript, the majority of the artists chose to depict David holding either the kithara or the psaltery in various geometrical forms, such as rectangular, quadrilateral, and square. At this point, it is important to focus our attention on two more illuminations regarding this verse of the psalm. The first one, on the left part of the presentation, depicts David holding a triangular psaltery with many more musical instruments positioned around him, probably implying the instruments of the temple. The second one, on the bottom right part, demonstrates the psalmist carving the violin-like instruments following the divine command of an angel. In the sequence of events, we are informed that Prophet Samuel took a horn and poured anointing oil over David's head, recognizing him as the future king of Israel in front of his brothers, who the Lord did not choose. I went out to meet the allophile, and he cursed me by his idols. But I, having drawn the dagger from him, I beheaded him and removed reproach from Israel's sons. The final two verses refer to the fight between David and Goliath, a well-trained Philistine warrior whose height was more than 2.4 meters. However, David was also a courageous mighty warrior who had killed in the past animals that were stronger than him, lions and bears, and were trusting to God to save him once again. Right before the beginning of the battle, Goliath cursed David by his gods, and soon afterwards he moved closer to attack. David then reached into his bag and took out a stone that he slung and struck the Philistine soldier on the forehead. After falling on the ground from the impact, David took Goliath's knife, killed him, and cut off his head. Following the battle, the panicky retreat of the Philistines' army and the pursuit by the Israelites, David carried his enemy head to Jerusalem, where he was greeted by King Saul at first and later on by the rest of the residents. This gruesome narration provided the last source of inspiration to illustrators who chose to depict both the decapitation of Goliath and the warm welcome that David received upon his return. Many musical instruments are depicted in those illuminations, such as cymbals, drums, trumpets, tambourines, stringed instruments, and psalteries. Last but not least, it's worth focusing our attention on one illumination where we can observe people dancing in circle, celebrating David's triumphant victory over Goliath while striking membrane drums and cymbals, following the well-known example of Miriam's dance that we have explained earlier when she and the rest of the Israelites crossed successfully the Red Sea. The Book of Psalms consists of an ordered arrangement of lyrics to tell a sequence of events. The events include Israel in exile, the appearance of the Messiah, the ingathering of Israel, the attack of the nations, the heroes' suffering, the scattering of the Jews, the appearance of a divine figure that will save them, the establishment of the kingdom of God, the prosperity of Israel, and the respect of the nations. Even though contemporary scholars strongly oppose to the identity of the person who compiled this poetic collection, the Book of Psalms is generally attributed to King David, whom the illustrators have repeatedly depicted in different scenes and in different surroundings, illustrating the prophet's saga. The use of musical instruments is evident on many cases that not only emphasize and enhance the psalmic text, but furthermore serve as means of praise to God and celebration of his divine intervention, magnificent deeds, and remarkable wonders. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Dr. Baturakis, for this wonderful speech that enlightened our view about the aspect. Now, I think we can proceed with your questions, because I have just again observed that your session is separate from the other one. So I think it is better to take the questions about your speech and then move to the next session. I think it will be much more appropriate, if you agree. And now maybe we can have some questions, dear guests. Any questions? At the moment, am I right? Okay. So I think
Cenk Hocam, can I have a question?
Of course.
I was a little bit late. Sorry for my disruption in that sense. I had to fulfill another unexpected duty, let's say. But I have noticed Miriam's dance among the illuminated manuscripts. And I usually come across with Salome's dance in the same way or in the same formula. Is there any comparison or Salome dances with the head of Johannes, John the Baptist, on a plate, and occasionally also more or less the same formula, with the same formula, she dances and carries this the plate. Is there a common approach for a dancing figure, or I'm sorry, I couldn't listen to the first part of it, but I've just seen this iconography, and it was the iconography I've been dealing with because I was studying the life of Ioannis Prodromos, Saint John the Baptist, and quite recently I also have come across with a recent work, Salome, before the death of Johannes, again dances and prepares herself. So is there any study or work or comparison the dancing of these females with the Castagnettes sometimes? Thank you.
Thank you, dear John, for your question. Actually, this reminds me of a study that I have presented regarding the dance. And we have studied the Miriam's dance, Salome's dance, and Theodora with all her followers on a mosaic. Unfortunately, I cannot remember which mosaic and at which date that was. We focused especially on the clothes, and we see that we have veils over the head. If I may share once again this presentation, the veils are evident on most surroundings. These veils over the head in the blue, especially on the right part of the slide, is very common. I believe that in Salome's dance, she also have such a veil. However, I cannot recall if in Salome's dance representation there are musical instruments visible. I remember the scene with the plate and her approach towards the king, but I cannot recall if there are any instruments. I'm sure that in Theodora depiction there aren't any. The illustrators did not choose to depict Theodora previous past and focused mainly on her as an empress.
And this blue veil, we have also examples of blue veil in a female figure with the personifications. For example, personification of Nux, knight, has that kind of element. Is there more an iconography, a visual iconography, and the connection with the, as I couldn't listen the whole part on that section, how was your interpretation? Because there's a representation of a personification with blue whale, and there are examples in that way.
First of all, the Byzantine women were not supposed to show off their hair. That's why the veil is there to cover their hair, because it was unethical for Byzantine women to demonstrate her hair. That's why they use primarily the veils. The veils can be seen in two forms, in blue color or red color. So is David. David is 90% of the cases depicting wearing reddish chlamys over him. Perhaps there is a link between this color and the porphyra color that was used to the emperors that attributed the Porphyrogenitos epithet. Maybe this is a sort of imperial practice. That's why David and Miriam, who are connected to Moses, they're connected to the Christianic religion, are shown depicted wearing red fabrics during their iconography. Perhaps this is worth investigating more.
Exactly, Antonios. And we also know from the oratory, from the written evidence, there was always a strong analogy between David as a figure and the king of the Byzantine emperor, let's say. So thank you very much. It's always very fascinating and interesting because you have both the visual material and also music side of it. It's really very interesting for me. I will ask later on.
Thank you.
Later this afternoon. Thank you.
Very much.
Antonios, thank you, Sercan Hocam, for the nice question. Any other questions, please? If you have any other, we can forward it to Antonios. I think that's all at the moment. So if you have further questions, you can just write on the chat screen or ask afterwards by email or in other ways. So,
can I interrupt? Sorry.
Sorry.
If I may interrupt, replying to dear Sercan, here is what I was talking about. Salome is wearing the long floppy sleeves. The long floppy sleeves is a common practice to those who were involved in the mocking of Christ depictions. We can see in manuscripts preserved at the Loretiana library, at the Torino library, dancers with long flop sleeves. So what Salome is doing here, her intention is to mock John the Baptist. That's why she's seen again, though wearing a red dress. In most of the depictions, the veil, as we told before, is a veil over their heads, a blue or a red one. Just as to reply even clearer to your question, I don't know if that helps, but I wanted to share this illumination again with you.
Thank you very much, Antonios. It seems throughout, from the Byzantine times onward, there has been a change in the interpretation and reflection of Salome's dance and her costume or dress or garments as well, it seems so. And because I also remembered the interpretation in the literature, and Salome's dance always had this, it was emphasized and it was highlighted also at the beginning of the last century. And there was a fashion, as far as I know, but it has a change in the depiction. It was very nice. I will look for other examples and ask you later on. Thank you, Antonios. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sercan Hocam. Thank you, Antonios. Not any other questions. Let us skip to the next session because I think it's time to start. Second session of this afternoon event will be about the contemporary influences. Of course, again, taking in scope the Byzantine music. Professor Alexander Lingas as the first speaker. Hello, welcome, dear professor.
Hello, good afternoon.
Maybe I can give a small review about your CV, if you let. Thank you very much. Professor Alexander Lingas is the founder and music director of the vocal ensemble Cappella Romana and a fellow of the University of Oxford's European Humanities Research Center. His present work embraces historical study, ethnography, and performance. He was formerly an assistant professor of music history at Arizona State University's School of Music. He received his PhD in historical musicology from the University of British Columbia. His academic awards include Fulbright and Onassis grants for musical studies with Cantor Lykorgos Angelopoulos, a Canadian postdoctoral fellowship for study under Metropolitan Callistos of Dioclea, and the British Academy Postdoctoral Research Fellowship held at St. Peter's College, Oxford. His publications include articles for the Oxford Companion to Music, the New Groove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and many monumental, we can say, sources. Since founding Cappella Romana in 1991, Dr. Lingas has appeared with the ensemble at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Pontificio Istituto Orientale in Rome, the Irish World Music Center in Limerick, Princeton University, and Yale University. Cappella Romana has been featured on over 20 CD recordings. These data are among the many qualifications of dear Professor Lingas. So the word is yours. We are very honored to have you here, dear Professor.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a wonderful conference. I'm just sorry I can't join you in person. I hope to do that at some point in the future. Yes, and I should have sent you the much shorter biography I normally send to people these days. So anyway, again, dear colleagues, thank you for this. I'm just going to share my screen here. See. All right. In his opening keynote lecture for this conference, we heard Professor Terzakis eloquently describe from a personal perspective some of the key historiographic and creative problems facing anyone in modern times seeking to locate Greek ecclesiastical chanting in relation to Western art music. Recalling his own journey as a composer, he recounted first the near total absence of so-called Byzantine music from the historical narratives of Western classical music's development that he encountered upon arrival in Germany. He then told us how the supreme self-confidence of that era's serialists as heralds of progress in music led them to resist fiercely his efforts to compose new music on any other basis. My own contribution to this conference will likewise consider the cultural location of Byzantine chant or Byzantine music. Both are late 19th century appellations that in many languages now regularly displace more historic usages, including the ancient ecclesiastical psalmody or the late medieval psaltic art. But to consider those in relation to the canons of Western art music. I shall briefly address the same themes of history, tradition, and creativity as they have been understood by both observers, external and internal. Beginning with basic issues of historiography, I will touch upon perceived continuities and discontinuities in the notated and oral transmission of Orthodox liturgical singing of the Balkans and Eastern Mediterranean, manifested in musical style and performance practice. This will lead me to survey modern creative responses to historical and received repertories of Byzantine chant. These range from renewed efforts to include them in broadened canons of European early music to their use as inspiration for all sorts of new compositions. As I have shown elsewhere, the notion of Greek and Latin ecclesiastical chant as stylistically compatible siblings descended from early Christian worship of the late antique Roman Empire persisted through the Middle Ages. Despite the progressive estrangement of the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches from the 7th century onwards, having turned literally hundreds of often seemingly minor differences in practice into points of theologized disputes. This is something, by the way, that Tia Kolbaba has written about in her book on the errors of the Latins, the lists of the errors of the Latins. Despite all this, chanting continued to be perceived as largely musical common ground through the first half of the 15th century. A full account of how this subsequently changed requires much further study, but the respective othering of the mainstream traditions of Eastern Orthodox and Western or Central European sacred music becomes visible in writings produced not long after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Two general trends may nevertheless be discerned. The first is that cultural drift between parts of Europe and the Mediterranean, divided into Western European Christian and Ottoman Islamic spheres of rule, accelerated in the former by the widespread dissemination of composed polyphony, a development that was facilitated by the introduction of mechanical music printing in Venice at the beginning of the 16th century. Distaste for the music of the other gradually becomes the norm for many people on both sides of the socio-religious divide. Already at the end of the 16th century, we find the Spanish composer Francisco Guerrero, who was en route as a pilgrim to the Holy Land, describing the Greek chant that he encountered on the island of Zakynthos as muy simple e ignorante. Musical oppositions between East and West had long hardened by the time that Chrysanthos of Maditos, one of the architects of the new method of ecclesiastical chant notation adopted by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 1814, wrote his great theory of music. In this work, which otherwise displays considerable influence of the Hellenic Enlightenment and was published in Trieste in 1832, Chrysanthos expresses his appreciation for the technical achievements of Western European art music, even as he notes his complete aesthetic indifference to their musical results. In Western Europe, many trained musicians had similarly come to view Byzantine chanting as, at best, an arduously acquired taste. This can be seen, for example, in the commentary that scholar and Roman Catholic choir master Sir Richard R. Terry offered in 1909 to accompany a demonstration of Byzantine music by some of his singers. I must ask you not to smile at the singing, because the effect of hearing this music for the first time with trained English voices is curious. When you hear the regular Arab singing, it is much as if a person were holding his nose and howling. Even Dr. Fortescue in his book calls it caterwauling. That's a book on the Eastern Orthodox churches by the Catholic scholar Fortescue. My own experience is that when Oriental singers get to the upper notes of the scale, it is generally difficult to know what they are trying to sing. In any case, the chromatic melodies sound weird when listened to for the first time. Most of my friends, after I've given them a bar or two, say "thank you" with such fervent emphasis that it clearly indicates they have had enough. The second view, found first in Russian sources of the later 15th century promoting the ideal of Moscow as Third Rome, is that polyphony is itself a heretical practice. What have you seen of worth among the Latins? They do not even know how to venerate the Church of God. They raise their voices as the fools, and their singing is a discordant wail. They have no idea of beauty and reverence and worship, for they strike trombones, blow horns, use organs, wave their hands, trample their feet, and do many other irreverent and disorderly things, which bring joy to the devil. Of course, after many struggles, including the schism of the old ritualists in the 17th century, the Russian Orthodox Church eventually made its peace with polyphonic singing derived from the traditions of Western art music. Interestingly, the use of polyphony seems not to have been a point of contention, at least at first, among the Greeks. Thus, we find Meletios Pigas, who at different times occupied the patriarchal thrones of Constantinople and Alexandria, adopting an irenic stance on this issue. For it is said, "Sing to God, you righteous ones of his." One can praise divine things not only through monophonic chanting, but also through polyphonic harmony, which is not discordant according to the custom of each country, so that we may neither give nor take offense. Addressing the stylistic and aesthetic gaps between contemporary East European art music and the received musical traditions of Eastern Orthodox worship became a pressing concern for Orthodox Christians of the Balkans only in the 19th century, with the emergence there of independent nation states, as well as the political reforms and growing cultural westernization in many of the Ottoman Empire's remaining provinces. Particular to speakers of Greek was the cultural dissonance arising from the overlaying or replacement of their long-standing identity as Romi or Rum with that of a neo-Hellenism still very much under construction. Controversies over the historical provenance, authenticity, and future of received Greek traditions, perhaps known best from the so-called language question, had their analogues in disputes over ecclesiastical music. Hanging on these debates, sometimes called collectively the musical question in contemporary sources, was the specter of Western art music as a rival tradition to be resisted, ignored, or joined, depending on one's views of the legitimacy of the received traditions and their appropriate fate: maintenance, further development, purification, assimilation, or abandonment. I've written elsewhere about many of these issues, and my time today is limited, so for now I shall note only the range of responses from within the domains of Orthodox Church and modern Hellenism have been extremely broad. On the conservative end of the spectrum, we find partisans of the received traditions of Byzantine chanting, combining historical narratives of continuity with polemical assertions of orthodoxy, echoing those first articulated in 16th century Moscow. In their preface to the Musiki Pandekti of the early 1850s, for example, the teachers of chant at the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople wrote, "Our sacred ecclesiastical music is more ancient and pure than those now possessed by contemporary heterodox Orthodox communions, being contemporaneous with primordial Christianity and indisputably handed down from the apostles. Since we, to whom it has fallen today to be ministers of this tradition, are obliged to hold on to the sacred deposit of our fathers as one of the most essential sacred traditions of the Church, unadulterated and free of innovation." Sidestepping to varying degrees the need to define heterodoxy musically, others have argued that Byzantine music is one of the world's great classical traditions, comparable in stature to Western art music, employing its own technical means and possessing its own canon of great composers and masterpieces. Elements of this approach are to be found in the massive volume of Contributions to the History of Our Ecclesiastical Music by the Constantinopolitan music educator Yorgos Papadopoulos, published in 1890. Despite the efforts of Papadopoulos and such contemporaries as Konstantinos Psachos to advance the musicological study of Greek ecclesiastical chant from native perspectives, it was really only during the last quarter of the 20th century that scholars, performers, monasteries, and institutions of higher education and the performing arts have provided sufficient infrastructure to advocate both at home and abroad for Byzantine chant as Greece's indigenous tradition of ecclesiastical music, of classical music, rather. And, you know, both at home and abroad, one person promoting this view very strongly was the late Lykurgos Angelopoulos with his Greek Byzantine choir. Also true of my friend and colleague Achilleas Chaldeakis and his teacher Grigorios Stathis with the maestores of the psaltic art. I mean, this sort of reached its apogee in some ways, or its first apogee, with a series of concerts at the then still newly constructed Athens concert hall, the Megaro Musikis, where Byzantine chant and its composers were presented in the same kind of format of series that you might have a Beethoven cycle in the same concert hall. I'll back up for the moment. Yet it is also important to recognize that, actually, I'll just go, actually, there we go. So this was the slide I was looking for. And now in more recent times, we have the choir Tropos, conducted by a student of Angelopoulos, Konstantinos Angelidis, coming up with a series with explicitly this program. It's called Klasiki Ekklesiastiki Musiki, and it's the preface to one of its booklets states the following: all peoples teach their own culture. The Germans teach Bach and Beethoven. We don't have those others. We have Kukuzelis and Karikis. We should learn about them. Yet in Greece, this awful thing happens. Whatever Western is thought to be more beautiful. These thoughts of our teacher, Lykuros Angelopoulos, inspired us to create a new series of publications with the general title, Classical Ecclesiastical Music. Classical ecclesiastical music is our classical music. Full stop. Yet it is also important to recognize that globalization and other changes in the musical cultures of the modern West, taken broadly to include much of the developed world today, have radically altered external views of Byzantine music, especially as perceived outside the confines of academia. Western and Central European scholarship on Byzantine chant appeared not long after the establishment of Musikwissenschaft as a modern academic discipline, appearing at first mainly as a kind of adjunct to the search for the origins of Gregorian chant, itself a project closely related to the practical restoration of medieval melodies spearheaded by the monks of Salem. A few, mainly French and Russian scholars, notable amongst whom was Louis-Albert Bourgault-Ducoudray, saw Byzantine chanting in its received form as a repository of ancient and medieval elements. Far more common, however, was the adoption of historical narratives paralleling those of art historians that emphasized the increasing divergence of Greek and Latin traditions as the latter approached the Renaissance. In musicology, this fit neatly with inherited prejudices against received traditions of Greek chanting as disfigured by centuries of exposure to the decadent Orient. As I've written elsewhere, it also motivated the founders of the Monumenta Musicae Byzantinae, oops, there we go, you can see them there, to effect a restoration of medieval Byzantine chant that was congruent with the scholarly and aesthetic positions of Salem. As hopes for this restoration receded, so too did conceptions in academia of Byzantine chant as a necessary prologue to the history of Western art music, linking it to the music of ancient Greece. In some standard textbooks, such as Donald J. Grout's A History of Western Music and its multiple editions, this only resulted in the reduction of space allotted to Byzantium. Far more common now, as for example in Richard Taruskin's 5-volume Oxford History of Western Music, is its complete exclusion. So Taruskin begins 9th century with the Carolingian dissemination of Gregorian chant. Ironically, the fading of Byzantine chant from the historical narratives of Western art music has been accompanied by cultural trends that have made it aesthetically viable for consumption by audiences lacking any ancestral ties to its cultivation. One is the space created by Western classical music's partial loss of cultural hegemony in modern society. Another is the gradual disappearance in many places of visceral prejudice against sounds perceived as Oriental. This has perhaps not coincidentally proceeded with the deployment of technology facilitating the instantaneous electronic dissemination of music. Under these new conditions, the psaltic art in its historic and received forms has come to be accepted variously in recent years outside its normal ecclesiastical environment as non-Western classical music, spiritual music, world music, and even, once again, as part of an extended realm of European early music, which that's one of the niches that my own ensemble fits into recently, for example, at the Utrecht Early Music Festival. Meanwhile, within the confines of orthodoxy, one finds Byzantine chant imbued with unprecedented levels of prestige, as it has come to be adapted to new languages for worship in regions far beyond its native lands. Influential in this regard has been the late 20th century revival of monasticism on Mount Athos, both indirectly as a renewed center of spiritual authority and directly as a producer of musical books and recordings. You see some Byzantine chant in Finnish there. As far as the Mount Athos as an engine of this movement, you can see, of course, the various publications of Vatopedi and other monasteries of Mount Athos. And here's an example of Byzantine chant in English by my friend and colleague, John Boyer. By way of conclusion, I only have time to offer a few brief observations of how all this relates to the creative use by modern musicians of the historical inheritance of Byzantine singing. Notions that the received repertories and practices of Greek ecclesiastical chanting were in need of wholesale restoration, purification, or modernization, once extremely widespread, are today of relatively minor concern within the Orthodox Church. On the contrary, in some churches, notably those of Albania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania, but also to varying degrees even in Russia and North America, partisans of Byzantine chant are found on the offensive, whether against composed polyphony or variants of originally Byzantine musical traditions that had indigenized over the course of centuries, as is the case, for example, with the Serbian pajanje. In concert halls, the stylistic plurality ushered in by postmodernism has allowed composers to pursue a wide range of stylistic approaches to the use of Byzantine musical materials in new works for voices and instruments. A few composers, the late Michael Adamis comes to mind, have systematically forged distinct compositional procedures derived from the raw material of traditional Greek sacred and folk music. Of course, Dimitris Terzakis is also a prime example of that. Others have been more selective in their use of Byzantine chant, using its melodies and modes in a variety of ways. Greek-American composer Taiki Zes, for example, has cultivated an idiom of modal sacred polyphony, drawing simultaneously on Byzantine chants and Renaissance procedures. Recently, Philip Glass wrote a piano quartet entitled Annunciation that was commissioned by the pianist Paul Barnes, a Greek Orthodox cantor who supplied Glass with a Byzantine communion chant, upon which one of the quintet's movements is based. The sound of Byzantine music is also refracted in works by another group of composers, drawing on traditions of Orthodox liturgy, including Father Ivan Moody, the late Sir John Tavener, and somewhat less obviously, Arvo Pärt, whose wife Nora confirmed for me that one of the inspirations for his so-called Tintinabuli style was the Ison, the Isokratima. So that's really the end of this brief presentation. I've had a very brief tour of quite a broad range of historiographic material. Had I included recordings and the like, it would have stretched out to an hour. So perhaps at some future meeting, but thank you very much for your attention.
Dear Professor Lingas, for your enlightening speech and for being here with us. Thank you very much. I think we will have the questions later on. I think it's better to take the questions at the end of the session. So if you agree, let us skip to our next valuable speaker, dear Professor Emmanuel Yiannopoulos is here. And we are again very honored to have Professor Emmanuel Yiannopoulos from Aristoteles University of Saloniki. And I will now give a brief, again, knowledge about the CV. His main area of concentration is Byzantine music, especially with a specialization on Celtic art. His research interests include handwritten and printed tradition of the Celtic art, the new method of the Celtic notation, after especially the 19th century, the relevance between word and melody on Byzantine music, the Celtic and musicological approach of the Byzantine music's various kinds and genres, and great composers. This valuable contribution, influences and benefits of the Celtic art on the 20th century Greek music. So, Professor Emmanuel Yiannopoulos, the word is yours. We are very honored to have you here too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. And I would like to express many thanks to the organizer of this wonderful and very interesting conference for the kind invitation to participate as a speaker in it. I'm trying to show you. I think now it's okay. Can you see my screen, please? Yes?
Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. I'm really impressed by your interest in Byzantine music, or better to say, Celtic art or music science, as its great maestros called it for centuries. From the rich tradition that this music created, today I choose to present some evidence about how it influenced contemporary Greek music, especially the music of the 20th century. The information on this topic are too many and particularly important, so one cannot easily choose which to mention and which to omit in the limited time of a Congress. I hope that with what I will mention below, I will give you a good picture of the subject, although very, very limited. Shortly after the founding of the modern Greek state in the 19th century, efforts began to revive many activities of Greek antiquity, including the performance of ancient tragedies and plays, first in halls and then in their natural place, the ancient theaters. In this effort, it was necessary the appropriate music to be composed for each one of these tragedies. Musicians who were well educated in the art of chanting as an organic continuation of the ancient Greek musical tradition, undertook the duty to create the melodies of these performances. First, Ioannis Sakellarides in the end of the 19th century, and then Konstantinos Psachos in the third decade of the 20th century, presented such composition in Athens. The first one published several musical scores of his work, taught the actors to perform them, and due to his excellent voice, he himself also sang several parts from the tragedies, Electra and Antigone by Sophocles, with great success. It is very characteristic that this event was so unprecedented in those last years of the 19th century that the Prime Minister of Greece, the entire cabinet, the directors and the members of the Foreign Archaeological Mission in Athens attended it with great interest in the main hall of the university and elsewhere. The opinions about Sakellarides' music were enthusiastic, and the main comments focused on this was very melodic, but also simple and unpretentious, so that the lyrics of the ancient tragedies could be highlighted and be easily understandable, and not be overshadowed by a complex and excessive musical composition. Exactly the goal that the Psaltic art seeks to achieve, to emphasize the beauty and mainly the meanings of hymnography. It is characteristic that some of these compositions by the skillful chanter and musician Sakellarides, who chanted with his brilliant voice in Athens until the age of 85, were recently performed in Beijing, and in fact by Chinese students, actors, in ancient Greek language, translating the ancient Greek poetry in another country, in another culture. Here you can see some newspaper of this era, when Sakellarides presented these melodies, this composition of various ancient Greek tragedies. And as I told you, all the comments are very enthusiastic about his effort to put again these lyrics, these plays, to set in music these plays. And this is a book of him, published in 1907. In the preface, he wrote how important is the knowledge of ecclesiastical and folk Greek music when somebody wants to compose music for the ancient tragedies. And as I told you, in Beijing some years ago, these melodies of Sakellarides again performed by Chinese actors and singers. A similar effort was made by Konstantinos Psachos, who arrived from Constantinople in Athens in 1904 to teach the authentic traditional Psaltic art. Psachos composed the music for the shocking tragedy of Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound, Prometheus Desmotis, which was performed in 1927 in the imposing ancient theater of Delphi. Psachos also composed the music for some other similar plays, like the Euripides play The Suppliants. We can see that in those years, outstanding ecclesiastical musicians undertook the duty to bridge the musical gap between ancient and modern times. Their specialization in Greek Psaltic art helped them to approach more successfully the older artistic works of the same culture. And as Oscar Wilde wrote, in his work, De Profundis, it is always a source of pleasure and awe to me to remember that the ultimate survivor of the Greek chorus, lost elsewhere to art, is to be found in the servitors answering the priest at Mass. Other composers with very good knowledge of Celtic art who presented a similar composition of ancient works during the 20th century. You can see some names here: Georgios Paktikos in Athens, in Constantinople too, Marios Varvolis, who composed the music for at least 4 ancient plays, Mikis Theodorakis, who died 2 months ago, Christodoulos Halaris, Christos Leondis, and others. Greek composers who more or less know ecclesiastical music and use its musical forms in their own composition. I will give you some examples. Manos Hatzidakis and Mikis Theodorakis, the most famous Greek composer of the 20th century, had great influences from Celtic art on their work, and they also state that this specific music is the base of modern rebetiko music, the authentic songs of the poor people who suffered during their lives and expresses the difficulties, their love, their special occasion, the everyday problems with their lyrics and composition, and the modern folk songs. Hatzidakis in 1949 delivered a historic lecture in which he defended the rebetiko and presented the basic features of these songs in a period in which most of the people rejected this music. Hatzidakis concentrated on the inner power of these songs and of their composers and performers, of course. The simple musical formulas and the strong lyrics, the authentic, powerful, and at the same time, restrained performance of this song. Everything in rebetiko songs reveals the source, which is none other than the strict and unpretentious ecclesiastical melodies. Observing the melodies line of the rebetiko songs, we can clearly see the influence, or better, the extension of the Byzantine music. In an official document signed by Patriarch Joachim, Constantinople, 1880, the Orthodox Church expresses the basic features of the Celtic art. It is impressive to compare this feature to Hatzidakis' notes about rebetiko music 70 years ago. The official document of Joachim, magnificence because of its simplicity. Musical formula, Hatzidakis says about rebetiko, musical formulas without many embellishments. Modesty when we chant with humility, calmness, and devoutness. Restrained performance, inner power, which sometimes shock the audience. Clear voice and clarity. Power, consciousness, experience, authentic content. Austere and melodic chanting. All the elements in the rebetiko are given to us without many ornaments. Let's speak about Mikis Theodorakis. Mikis Theodorakis uses many melodic ideas from Celtic art in his composition, and in some of his classical works, he also used some specific melodies from the ecclesiastical composition of the Holy Week in his Symphony No. 3, number 3. Although he conducted an ecclesiastical choir and chanted in the church from the age of 16, 17, he started learning the Celtic notation when he was about 50 years old. Well known all over the world, he transcribed hymns to the staff notation, and he declared, "What is the new thing that we, the Greek composers of the 20th century, brought to music, which hadn't been written by the unexcelled Byzantine composers? I have in my mind how many years I lost in the conservatories trying to learn exclusively the rules of the Western music while I scorn our rich musical heritage." I had already started studying Byzantine music in Zatuna in about 1970 with the valuable help of the parish priest. Writing the Byzantine melodies on paper, I realized how close the world of our modern folk and art music is to the Byzantine musical universe. And in an interview in 2006, is there a song that you close inside of your songs that is your mystagogy, the highlight? Is there a song that vibrates your soul the most? I will not say about my own song, but I am a child of the church. I am a child born with Byzantine music, and that's exactly why in my third symphony I put the three hymns, Eigene, Passe, and so on. But of course, the boulder on which I stepped as a person and as a musician is Ti Hypermachou, a very well-known hymn of the Orthodox Church. That's where it all starts and stops in music, I think. And in another occasion, he stated, regarding the influence of the Byzantine melody on my music, I can say that it is in every one of my works, in almost every one of my melodies. Of course, we can mention many other composers like Manolis Kalomiris, Ioannis Papaioannou, Nikos Kalkotas, Marios Varvoglis, Emilios Driadis, Petros Petridis, Antiochos Evangelatos, I'm sorry, please, Nikos Astrinidis, Michail Sandamis, and many others. But let's speak about Dimitris Terzakis. My grandfather stated, used to take me with him to church, where I listened to Byzantine church music. At the same time, we had a gramophone and records at home. And from there, I started listening to Central European music. So I got 2 ears, one for the Eastern, the other for the Western music. Some titles of some of his compositions strongly related to the Celtic art. Chroe, Ikos in 1970, Καταβασίες, Τυχηρών, Ενεθήτω, Χρωματική Τρόπη, Liturgia Profana, Legetos. As Theodoros Karatheodoros wrote in the work of Dimitris Terzakis, Legetos, someone can see the transformation of elements of Byzantine musical culture into modern synthetic thought. Let's speak about the field of modern folk music. Apostolos Kaldaras, from his youth, he apprenticed to the precentor of his parish, who distinguished Apostolos' musical ear and placed him as Isocrates in his ecclesiastical choir. The Byzantine melos is also the element that influenced and characterized Kaldaras as a musician. I learned to distinguish the modes of Byzantine music and many other fields of it. Later, when I grew up, I became a member of the ecclesiastical choir, which chanted together with the precentor and accompanied him, sometimes also in a polyphonic style. In the meantime, I had attended many Byzantine musical courses by the left chanter of our church, but I abandoned them when I started writing love songs with my guitar. The nature has won, as we can see. These are the musical origin of Apostolos Kaldaras. Add to that the influence of folk music due to his mother from the traditional village Metsovo, who sang songs from Epirus area in an exquisite way. Byzantine music, the songs of Asia Minor, great musician of the Rebettikon song, the musical tradition of Epirus is a blessed mix that will ignite the inexhaustible sources talent that will give for 45 years some of the most beautiful Greek folk songs. In his songs, the influence of the Byzantine composition is clearly visible, perhaps more than any other composer. A profound consciousness of the strict, austere, unpretentious ecclesiastical hymn, he highlights it as a source in his excellent composition. Kaldaras wrote about his work Byzantine Vespers. For a long time, it is 12 songs written in the beginning of a decade of 1970s. For a long time, I have been thinking to compose the Byzantine Vespers. As the people who will listen it will understand, this work is a cross of modes of the Byzantine 8-mode system. This was done deliberately because otherwise melodies would have emerged which would have had the ecclesiastical style. I think I avoid that. Elements of Western music are completely missing from this work. From this reason, for the most part, the composition of the orchestra that takes part in the performance of the song consists of instruments that, in my opinion, best suit the climate in which I work: sanduri, lute, clarinet. From this intersection of the modes of the Byzantine octaechia with the necessary phthore, for my purpose, came out 12 musical modes which to this day are used by our original folk songs. I would like to emphasize that each song of Byzantine Vespers is written in a different way, and in addition, each of them has its own unique rhythm. Greek composers who utilize hymns of the Orthodox Church and present them through their own musical point of view. Of course, many of the aforementioned musicians, like Dimitris Terzakis, who presented his work Iki in 1917, based on the poetry of Romanos the Melodies from the 6th century, a very famous Christian hymnographer. Stavros Kouyoumdjis, here in Thessaloniki, hymns of angels in rhythms of people. The Troparia he, Kouyoumdjis, chose and composed as a single musical work in which the composer's melodies connect the old with the new, always on the Byzantine roots. It is, in our opinion, a work that thrills us not only religiously, but more musically, as an art, with the stamp of the oratorio, since its main parts consist of performances with folk singers, choir, orchestra, and recitation. Marios Tokas from Cyprus, Mary who gave birth to God, Maria Theogenitria. Hymns written by Mang Gerasimos, the hymnographer, who lived in Mount Athos and died in 1991. The heavens praise you. We could hear some examples, but let me proceed to the other elements and we will see. And some new musician like Vasilis Hadjinikolaou, sorry for the Greek letters here, with an extensive Western musical education, rich talent, but also a deep training on Celtic art and activity which he continues for many years, reshapes the material of tradition, reaching very modern mixes with the contemporary music. Whether one agrees or not, this is a proposal, or better to say, many different approaches to post-Byzantine ecclesiastical music as we know it through the new method of analytical notation. Let us hear just for a few seconds Theotoki Elpis, a hymn to be chanted in the 2nd of February, the presentation of Jesus in the temple, but of course reshaped by Vasilis Hadjinikolaou. I'm not sure that I can also share, I can also share the sound. Yes, I think now we are okay. So. Can you hear, please? Okay? Okay, thank you. This specific hymn in many languages.
Madre di Dio, la speranza di tutti i cristiani.
As you can see, he reshapes the traditional music of the specific hymn, giving it in another way. Of course, with many instruments and in many languages. Instrumentalists who perform original or elaborated hymns of the Orthodox Church. Let me mention here Georgios Koros, a famous traditional violinist From his early age, he was taught Byzantine music by his father, who was a chanter, Aristides Moschos, a famous Sanduri player, and Nikos Saragoudas in Athens, who plays the oud. Here you can see this specific great musician, playing Byzantine hymns. A lot of Byzantine and post-Byzantine hymns performed in this way. Singers who benefited from the good knowledge or listening of the Psaltic art and later successfully dealt with other types of Greek music. I would like to give you some historical elements here. A daughter with blonde hair. This is one of the oldest Greek language recordings, recorded in 13 September 1901 in Lesbos Island. Singer is the Michalis Eftimiadis from Samsun, who was later a chanter. Let us hear just for a few seconds. Many are the singers or chanters who recorded church hymns, traditional songs, urban folk, rebettica in their older form. For example, in USA, during the second and third decades of the 20th century, many are the chanters who did such works. Melpo Logotheti Merlier recorded many ecclesiastical hymns and traditional songs in the decade of 1930. A refugee from Vourla, before singing and Amanes we asked him for, began to chant the doxology. Only with that, he told us, he could get into the musical mode of that difficult Amane. The ecclesiastical music as an apíchima intonation formula to begin a secular song. The well-known literature, Ilias Venezis, born in Ayvalik in 1904, wrote, when my compatriot from Palea Fokia, Focha, near Izmir, Eleni Nikolaidou, a great and famous mezzo-soprano, was invited from Vienna and then hired in the Metropolitan Opera of New York, the music experts could not distinguish in which musical school belonged the style of her voice and asked for an interview with the singer. She revealed that her first teacher was her father and precentor Antonios Nikolaidis, a refuge sunk in Aklidiou of Lesbos Island, and he had taught Byzantine music to his daughter. Another great singer, Dimitris Zachos. From 1951, he listened to the radio and had idols, the famous presenters Emmanuel Hadjimarkos and Mitros. When Hadjimarkos one heard his voice, he promoted him to the study of Byzantine music and traditional songs and delivered him some courses. Zachos stole, let's say, a lot from the chanter Hadjimarkos in setting up his voice and his melodic ornaments. He chanted for years in the metropolis of Athens and elsewhere, while immediately afterwards he appeared on the radio singing. At that time, the first singer of the folk song was Papasideris, a famous singer. I took his repertory, but I sang it in my own way, clean, beautiful, Byzantine. He became famous from his youth. He traveled around the world many times. The presenter of the metropolis of Athens, Spiridon Peristeris, another very skillful musician, also one of his teachers, insisted not to become a chanter, but a singer, because you will be unlucky if you deal only with chanting. Become a singer. Yannis Parios, the big school for me, a university, let's say, to be exact, was the church, the Sunday lectern. I was sucking like a sponge everything I heard. Manolis Mitsias, another famous singer of our days. He started as a chanter in the church and singer of traditional songs and became an excellent artist the last 50 years. He performed with an austere and Doric style some of the greatest modern Greek songs. Folk music is inextricably linked to Byzantine music. From there, the inspiration of a real creator springs through his past from tradition. If you are not inspired by tradition to reach the today practice, it will not be a Greek folk song. And Nikos Dimitratos, singer and actor with great vocal and acting skills. In 1948, at the age of 6, my mother sent me to the Metropolitan Church of Athens to serve the priest. In about 3 months, I realized that some other outside the choir are singing inside the sanctuary. So I also open my mouth and repeat what I hear. The director of the choir, Michalis Hadjis, linked the presenter, liked my voice, and since there, for 34 whole years, I have been in contact with Byzantine music, studying it and chanting in church. With his Doric Byzantine voice, excellent voice, Dimitratos performed many folk and modern songs, Greek songs, or some of them in an Oriental style. This was some elements I had in my mind to present to you. As I told you, someone could write a whole book speaking on this subject, but we only have some minutes in our beautiful conference, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yiannopoulos, for your valuable speech. And we will again leave your questions to the end of the session, if you agree, and have the last speech of the session, and then we will arise the question and answer part. So I will give the word to the last speaker, if you agree, and again, with a great thanks to you. I will now skip to Dr. Yiğit Aydın, one of the most honorable and important composers of our contemporary music stage of Turkey, and also an important name in the international scene too. A conductor, a composer, a faculty member of the Bilkent University Music and Stage Arts Faculty. Also, another important thing, he is the director of the Saygun Center, Saygun Research Center, that is constructed in Bilkent, and he is a follower of our great composer, Ahmet Adnan Saygun, also a very important professor of our conservatory too. And also Yiğit Aydın is a graduate from the Ankara State Conservatory, I should say with a great honor, of course. And his speech is very valuable for us, just coinciding with the other speeches, very related with the other speeches. He will speak about Saygun's composition. It's in a way regarding its relation with the Byzantine music and its theory. And his topic is Saygun in connection with Byzantine music and its theory. So, dear Yiğit Aydın now, and I also want to thank for all of his efforts in making this event possible as the director of the Saygun Center too. So, dear Hocam, the stage is yours. Thank you very much. And I will ask for a permission after that, because I had another speech in another symposium in St. Petersburg. So I will give the chair instantly to Nevin Şahin for the question and answer part, but I will be listening to your speech. So sorry for that, and please take the stage.
Thank you very much, Cenk Hoca. I'm honored with your introductory words. Thank you very much. And I'm honored to be with you today. I want to greet you all cordially. I want to thank Professor Lingas and Professor Yiannopoulos for the very inspiring presentations. Actually, in my presentation, I want to focus on a single composer from the other side of the sea, and from a maybe more structural perspective regarding our question, our subject matter. I want to share my screen. Ahmet Adnan Saygun is born in 1907. I want to give some brief explanation about his life, and he died in 1991. He studied music composition in Paris in Schola Cantorum, and I think in this connection, Schola Cantorum played a role because among his other teachers, Amédée Gastouet is his teacher, professor of Gregorian chant and modal music. And in my opinion, probably he was influenced, also Saygun was influenced by his thought about Byzantine music as well as Armenian music. And I assume he was involved with the ideas of Gastouet later on. And then after coming back to Turkey, he was influential in the modernization process of the cultural life, I would say, and in the foundation of a new music thought. Later on, in the Republican period, also after the Second World War, he has become a professor of composition in the Ankara State Conservatory, and he later on he switched to Istanbul, to the conservatory in Istanbul till his retirement. I want to discuss important resources of his music, which is connected to his ethnomusicological thought and also his ethnomusicological research in Turkey. In his research, he was mainly involved with among other things, with folk music and the main music legacies in Anatolia in the historical sense. And also he was involved with the culture exchange with different elements of folk music. The basic thing that I want to examine is his compositional strategy regarding these cultural legacies in Anatolia. And this is something that he invented in 1930s, and especially in his first creative period, this material and the use of that material is very clear and understandable, but later on it becomes, although he retains same elements, it becomes more complicated, more difficult to understand how he handles this. But from his middle period, I want to give some examples. There can be a lot of examples, by the way. But through this example, I assume we can understand how his approach is, because it is more of a structural approach regarding these culture domains and culture basins. In doing this, my proposition or my thesis is he has a clear conception of, musicological conception of the Anatolian culture domain. And he also believes that there are some clear focus points, and there is also a structural relationship between them. And then he weave them together, merge them together, and sometimes he leaps from one domain to the other. Sometimes he leaps to a certain historical domain, back to another domain. And then we can understand this as shifts between different historic and cultural periods, let us say. And he wants to, or he represents one domain with certain structural elements, another domain with other structural elements. I think they are more or less music metaphors. It is not easy to talk about music metaphors because the semantic component is limited in music. So the categorization of music metaphors can be something very interpretative, and it depends very much on the perspective. However, the music metaphor in Saigon, within this focus, is not that much of a symbolic. We can also find music symbols, however, more of a structural phenomena. So I would like to consider them as structural icons because it directly represents something in the perspective of Saigon. And also, like many of the composers from his generation, and also not only in the field of contemporary music, new Turkish music, but also in the classical Turkish music, many composers, many music theorists wants to, I think, reconcile the polarization between Europe and Anatolia, because now Turkish composers would like to participate in that international style, and in a certain sense, they would like to merge European and Anatolian elements and create a new language, which is, I mean, very typical throughout the world at that time. Probably also in Greece, so there are a lot of influences, and there is also the very important question: what are our roots, and what is the relationship with other culture domains? So it is also a vision. It is also about the future of that society. It is about the relationship with the Greek culture domain, and it is also about the relationship with the European domain. And so that I also would like to consider this as a civilizatory vision by Saigon. Let's consider also the music examples. Later on, we are going to see the scores as well. The music examples are actually small passages, small sections of an orchestral work. This is the first symphony by Saygun. Let's listen to the horn call at the very beginning. I hope the sound quality is okay. If there's a problem, please tell me. And after this, there is another small passage. Please think about the difference between these two elements. So what we have heard is a horn call and then a string passage. I think these two elements make up the main idea of this piece. And then let's listen to the following passages. For example, a small section from the transition. Now there is a relationship between these two elements, the horn call and the string section, with a different instrumentation. And then, in following passages of the transition, there is the two elements merge further into each other. Actually, at the end of the transition, these two elements completely merge into each other, and then the subordinate theme region begins. Now I'm talking according to the classical form conception. Subordinate theme is, with respect to instrumentation, it has a very classical orientation because it has a split work instrumentation with woodwind solo. And what is the structure behind this music is our question. According to Saygun, on the root of Turkish and European music, there is the same fundament, and it is the ancient Greek music thought, according to him. So, in a certain sense, the culture in Anatolia and the culture in Europe is interconnected according to its roots, according to their roots, because at a certain point, they both refer to ancient Greek music, though. This is actually, in this generation of musicians, composers, and musicologists, it is a shared thought. A group of intellectuals have that opinion. One of them is Rauf Yektabi. In his famous article in Encyclopedia La Musique Turque, he said that Europe and Turkish music they both refer to the same origin, but after some time, our region, not only Turkish music, but also the Eastern Mediterranean region and Europe split up into two. Then we refer them as Orient and Occident, and then they followed different paths. Rauf Yektabi believes now we have to come together again. We have to refer to our richnesses, our reciprocal richnesses. Sorry. On the other hand, there are also a lot of differences between authors. The main difference is that Saygun differentiates folk music style and classical Turkish music style according to two different origins. And on the other hand, the terminology is also very important in this respect, because generally we don't encounter the term Byzantine. Almost never we have this. And Turkish authors generally use the term Greek, especially in the early Republican period, in 1930s, 40s, 50s. And for example, Rauf Yektabi differentiates between Old Greeks and New Greeks. Ahmet Adnan Saygun generally speaks of the Greek culture with transformations, so to say. And what are the roots of Turkish music? A fellow musicologist from this time, from 1930s, Mahmut Ragıp Kösemihal, in 1936, he publishes this book, Tonal Characteristics of Turkish Folk Musics, in plural. He said he believes the origin of Turkish folk music is pentatonic, and he shares this opinion with Saygun, his friend Saygun. He also gives us the information that Saygun not only researches Turkish folk music, but also he's inspired with pentatonicism in his own music. I mean, he uses his research on Turkish folk music in his compositions as well. And the same year, also Saygun publishes a report on music with the title Pentatonicism in Turkish Folk Music. Here, I mean, we have actually two versions of this text, of this monograph. One is the report that is presented to Atatürk in 1935, if I'm not wrong, and the other one is the published version. In the report version, there is also stylistic ideas about classical Turkish music, because he differentiates between folk music and classical Turkish music. His first hypothesis is Turkish music is pentatonic in its roots, and this is also shared with Greek music thought, because pentatonism is also acknowledged in the 4th century before Common Era through the Greek authors. And here Saygun uses the expression scale with omitted degrees. He also refers to Hugo Riemann regarding this issue, his monograph on pentatonicism. And Saygun also gives some other opinions. He is going to reject these opinions later on, some decades later. He's going to regret them, actually. But here in pentatonicism in Turkish folk music, he says that pentatonicism is a mark of Turkish folk, is a sign of Turkish, or Turkic would be a better term, folks, Turkic people. And also he believed that it is a form of supremacy regarding music, because it is so widespread throughout the world. So this sign is also a kind of hegemony. Beginning with 1950s and 60s, he said he expressed this opinion as a kind of youthful excitement, and then he says nobody can talk about the origin of pentatonism. Nobody can know it because it's a prehistoric thing. But it is mentioned that way in the monograph. He also considered, as he makes that distinction, he considers classical Turkish music that it is tetrachordal in its foundation. So it follows ancient Greek music in that sense. Although he doesn't use the term Byzantine, within this text there is also some criticism of classical Turkish music, and probably this also concerns Byzantine music, although he doesn't use the term. For example, he means that, I mean, this Alaturka style is kind of narcotic or anesthetizing influence and kind of numb. This was his criticism. On the other hand, he also acclaims that this style is very open to music modernism. Also as a remedy of that quality, or that narcotic quality, so to say. And what is the reason for this? Because temporally it is very complex, and secondly, there is the microtonality, which is open to most modernist schools of music at that time, in 1930s, so to say. And he also gives names of some composers, and it is open to polytonality and polyrhythmy, so microtonal harmony and so on. So you cannot sacrifice it. We cannot sacrifice it. We have to refer to it as a source to modernism, is the idea. But as I say, some of the opinions in this book are going to change in time, especially the ethnocentric ideas are going to be eliminated in later years after the war, post-war period, so to say. In 1960, I want to mention two other sources from 1960s. One is another encyclopedic entry by Saygun himself this time, about the Turkish music, about the origins of Turkish music, about the theory of Turkish music. And I think here we can understand in a better way what he means in his perspective regarding Turkish music and its roots. He repeats the same idea that folk music should be of pentatonic origin, and classical Turkish music, the urban style of Turkish music, should be of tetrachordal origin. And he uses a certain terminology according to which these makams and usuls, I mean the rhythmic cycles or temporal cycles will be a better term, explained according to what he calls le monde antique, the antique world, actually according to the ancient Greek theory of music or ancient Greek thought on music. And he also reconnects folk music and classical Turkish music. It is not actually for him completely separate styles, but there are a lot of reconnections. There are a lot of connections, like the connection between Greek and folk music, the Greek and Turkish music. There's a connection between urban styles of Ottoman music and folk styles, because in the original tetrachord there is trichord, and probably at that point he was influenced by Hugo Riemann, because I mean, in this article he doesn't mention Hugo Riemann. However, within the trichord, a movable tone is interposed, and which he calls a mobile tone, and through that we have the tetrachord. And he also means, I mean, this is known in the ancient Greek. Let's consider some pages from this book. And although he doesn't use Byzantine, actually Byzantine is included, in my opinion, in a certain sense, but he doesn't use the term. For example, at one point he refers to Gaudens, to Gaudentius, and he said in the 4th century there was a transformation in that ancient perspective about music theory. And here he refers to Gaudentius. He said, not in combinations of tetrachords, but in combinations of tetrachords and pentachords, the music is explained, the scales, the modes are explained. And he says, however, this can be a critical point, with Gaudentius we have combinations of tetrachords, pentachords, and then we notate the scales in ascending order. He says, I want to write it only with tetrachords and in descending order, because it is as such in Turkish music, at least in Turkish folk music. However, he also mentions that the great authors of Turkish music theory, here Farabi and Safiyuddin, he refers to them a lot of times, Saygons refers to them, and he says, but they are loyal to that transformation beginning with the 4th century. So, but he is going to reject that loyalty. And let's turn some pages. He explains the intervals, especially small intervals, seconds, different seconds. He uses, like many other authors in Turkish tradition, he uses the Greek terminology. He also refers to microtonality. Is that okay now? Okay. And then he refers to tetrachords, and he uses the Greek terminology again here: genre Kurdi, genre Neva, Ajam, genre Hijaz. And Hijaz has a specific quality, as you see, because he labels it, at least within the text, as Turkish. And for example, he gives us the modes. For example, Kurdi, type Dorian, and also he gives the intervals. He gives the genres. This is, for example, disjoint Dorian, hypodu disjoint, and then he contains, for example, the intense form, hyper Dorian disjoint, and he continues like this. And on the right column, he gives Turkish names. Also, regarding the temporal aspect, he uses Greek terminology. Here, there is an interesting term he uses, le monde antique, Anatolico-Grec. He uses this term quite often. He's talking about an Anatolian Greek culture, and he means this is still alive in Turkey. The terminology he chooses, for example, Larsis, thesis, and other elements from poesy as well, the terms are generally in Greek origin, and he uses also pie, the flute, in explaining the rhythmic aspect of this music. Also, there are a lot of combinations. For example, some of the Greek terminology, some of the terminology from Muslim authors, Ottoman authors, and Ottoman literature, terms of Ottoman literature are used combined with Greek terminology. Especially the metric in Ottoman literature is used in Ottoman poetry. And as we can also look at the bibliography. He mainly refers to Rauf Yekta Bey, sometimes with critical terms, by the way. And also, for example, Sufi Ezgi, Darül Elhan Külliyatı, the publications of the Darül Elhan Conservatory, so to say. His friend Gazi Mihal, formerly Köse Mihal, and then he changed his last name, and his own publications in the field. Another interesting book from 1960s is The Fundamental Knowledge of Music. This is published through Turkish Ministry of Education, probably to be used in high schools, in middle schools, or in conservatories, professional music schools as well, but it is taught for middle schools and high schools, as far as I see. And there is a long chapter on Greek music. This chapter also works on a certain idea of, let us say, polarization between Europe and Eastern Mediterranean region. He says the chapter is entitled Non-Tonal Music. Music which is not tonal in that sense. And he says it is modal music, and there are two main types of modal music, pentatonic and tetrachordal. And pentatonicism and tetrachordality is interconnected. And how is the interconnection? As I said, depending on Hugo Riemann, trichord connected with movable tones, in Hugo Riemann's terminology, piano tones, and then tetrachord is constructed. And he also explains the conjoined and disjoint tetrachords and the modes resulting from them. And by the way, there is, if one point is interesting, although there's the antique world in his explanations, he actually, in the continuation of the chapter, he's talking about Greek music and the Greek modes and the Greek music theory. He doesn't make a distinction of old Greeks and new Greeks. He thinks there's a continuation, there's a big transformation, for example, beginning with the 4th century or so in his terms. However, it is Greek or Anatolico-Greek culture domain. For example, Rauf Yekta speaks of New Greeks, and he criticizes, but he's not specific about this. It is not clear what he means. He criticizes New Greeks music in the church. Probably he's talking about his own time, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And although, as I said, not clearly stated, but this New Greeks music in the church has some weaknesses, but not unclear. According to Saygun, he doesn't make that kind of distinction. I think it is a simple reason. He says, for example, he speaks of a certain mode, and then he says, you can find it in Anatolia. Or for example, within the ruins of a certain city, antique city, there is a song is written, and we have more or less the same song still living 2000 years after, still living in Anatolia. So I think he's talking about a continuity regarding the Greek culture or Greek music. Look at some pages of that chapter. As I said, I mean, he's talking about tonal music and then non-tonal music, which is modal. And what are the main types of modal music? Pentatonic music and tetrachord system. It is also interesting in a certain sense. I mean, if we consider his ideology, his perspective regarding this, although he leaves the idea to consider pentatonicism as Turkic, however, I mean, there is Europe, and the rest of the world is either pentatonic or tetrachordal, kind of such a perspective, at least for our region, at least Turkish or Greek in a certain sense. And then he continues, he's talking about tetrachords, beginning with the Dorian tetrachord, and then he also founds the relationship between three chords. He explains about the movable pitches, and for example, he gives the Dorian scale. He gives the Dorian scale, and immediately, I mean, he's talking about Greek music. He mentions Dorian scale, and he immediately gives an example from Anatolian Turkish music. So, I mean, music with Turkish text, so to say. So, I mean, connections with Europe, and then connections between Anatolia within Anatolia is his perspective regarding these legacies. And for example, this should be an antique song notated 2,000 years ago, and he says almost the same melody is something we have in Anatolia, in the same region, in Phrygian, by the way. So, I mean, actually, in this presentation, I'm not considering the correctness of his musicological thought, but how his music world is founded and how he uses it in his own music. This is the main focus of my presentation. And same, I mean, talking about Greek music, so to say, all examples from Turkish music. And now we can turn back to the symphony again. And then we can remember the small passages that we have listened to, and also we can look at the score. This is the horn call that we listened to, and this is the tetrachordal music in strings. I would consider this as a complex of basic ideas. I mean, this main theme is composed of two basic ideas. One is pentatonic in two horns, and the other one in strings, tetrachordal, as if it begins as if Dorian, but actually mainly it is chromatic tetrachord that he mentions also in his book on knowledge of music for high schools. Let's listen to the pentatonic idea. Two chromatic tetrachords connected together. And also in transition section, he combines these two ideas. I mean, they are not consecutively juxtaposed, but they merge into it. They begin to merge into each other. Let's listen to that measures. And then this merging into each other continues. Kind of Stravinsky language. And then in the subordinate theme, in the region of subordinate theme, actually the tetrachord and pentatonic element merge into each other so that we have combination of both. So And also these regions, these elements, they don't simply refer to merging of two culture fields into each other, but also, for example, I mean, at the beginning, there's pentatonicism and tetrachordal qualities as if 3,000 years ago. And then when they merge into each other in the subordinate theme in that region, the music leaps 2,000 years forward, so to say. I mean, it leaps to another historic domain. I mean, it combines geographies, it shifts between different historic domains, different culture domains, and then they merge into each other as if eliminating the schismata between them, or polarizations. And also, as you see, this is European music in a certain sense. I mean, it's instrumentation, its form, you can read it completely as European style, it is possible, but also all these structural elements, they are not simple symbols, but completely structural symbols. You can make a different reading of this style of this music. I think it is very interesting that he doesn't consider his material as something exotic, but completely structural. And also the relationship between, for example, Turkish music, according to him, and Greek music, and how they are related to each other, how they merge into each other and then spring 2,000 years forward. Is a structural phenomenon. We cannot simply listen to it and we say, okay, this is Turkish music, or this is Greek music. This is not something that he means, but something completely structural and probably not exotical, at least within the framework of this analysis. I think I used a lot of time, so thank you very much for your attention. And if Cenk is there, or if Nevin Hoca is there, I can turn back to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we are a little bit over time, but we still have some time left for 2 or 3 short questions. I'm checking the chat as well to see if there are any. I actually have one question to Alexander Lingas, and if there aren't anybody jumping up before me, I would like to pose my question. First of all, I would like to thank all the presenters of today's session, and sorry for my surprise chair. Things are not going always as we want them to be.
I am here. No problem. Just in sake of a problem, I asked you to make it, but thank you very much, Nevin.
You're welcome. If you want, I can leave the floor again back to you. But
we'll be just starting the other session now. So
okay then. Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
So we, in a very elaborate manner, saw how the tradition and the discussions about tradition influenced composers, and not only from compositional aspect, from performative and also from theoretical aspect, we can see the relationship and the tension. So my question is related to the tension between Western classical music and other classical music's discussion. There was a very similar discussion back in late 19th, early 20th century in the Turkish classical music domain as well. Some scholars were thinking that adapting too much to the Western classical music values would pollute the original classical music, so they should refrain from those Western values to preserve the music. And as a performer yourself, I would like to ask your experiences on the reflections in the audience of those discussions, because they keep popping up everywhere and they keep influencing composers in either including or excluding traditional or non-Western elements in their music. But how do the audience reflect on these discussions?
I think a lot of it depends on what the audience has at stake in the debate, because for people in Greece, especially those who might have strong memories of efforts to westernize Byzantine singing in the middle of the 20th century, or polemics about that it was somehow decadent music and it was part of a progress narrative that it needed to be modernized, may have much stronger reactions to this than say an audience of 80% or 90% people with no ethnic or religious ties to the music that we might be performing in a concert hall or music festival in Western Europe or the United States. For them, it's really more just a question of the beauty of the sounds. And one of the things too, that there's also a generational shift, I think, just in terms of the openness to the range of possible sounds as well, because I mean, one argument that actually one finds in literature about Eastern Orthodox church music in, say, the English-speaking lands and places outside of its native land, that people like my former supervisor, Metropolitan Kallistos, in the old editions of his book on the Orthodox Church, advocate for the notion that somehow Russian music, because it's culturally familiar, is the best thing for if one is going to do church music in for people who have no background in these things. And what's happened is, in many cases, that the most popular music is the Byzantine music with the notation and the microtones with the converts. So and then who go and study it in Greece or other places. So I think the scene has just shifted so much from the types of debates that were going on that we heard just in the last lecture, and that I kind of dealt with as well. Although there are still people here and there that are strongly invested in those positions as well. So it just really depends who you're talking to and where you go.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any other questions to our presenters? Because if not, I would like to give the floor to Sercan Hoca for her closing speech. We have been really tired in the last 2 days. It was really intense in the morning with the workshop, in the afternoon with the symposium. Very nice presentations, very nice discussions. And we are already very tired, and I don't want to tire people with my effort to force to ask questions. If there aren't any, I would like to close this session by thanking our presenters once more for their invaluable contribution, and would like to leave the floor to Sercan Hoca for her closing speech. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Nevin, I am going to take the word.
Okay, thank you.
Because we have talked with Luca Hoca, and then we decided that I give the last speech of the symposium.
Okay.
First of all, I want to thank many partners. I want to thank Bilkent Rector Abdullah Hoca, the Dean of the faculty in which we are making our symposium, Refet Hoca, and then the head of history department, Mehmet Hoca, Luca Hoca, to Sercan Hoca from Hacettepe University, and Cenk Hoca, Nevin, thank you very much to all to make this possible. It was a very good experience to us, because we had the opportunity to share a very large perspective within this symposium, especially the ones who participated to the workshop by Antonios Botanakis had the chance to experience the sounding of Byzantine music, of its notation, of its intonations, which was a great enrichment to us. And thank you to all. And I wish that this is just the beginning and the first step of a new kind of collaboration, especially between Turkish and Greek scholars. I think we have a lot to share, a lot to think about our exchange, about our thousands of years together, hundreds of years, and also we can think about our relationship with modernism, with the new era, and with Europe. Especially in the last session, cultural change has become the most important theme, and I think this brings an important inspiration not only for the research on history but also the research on today's world. Thank you very much to all. We are going to have our concert and hope to see you again. Thank you very much for all the contributions. Evet,